Listen carefully. There are names that were erased, not because they were weak, but because they were too effective. This is one of them. If you feel uneasy already, that's because this story was never meant to reach you intact. Imagine 5 plantation houses across Virginia's Tidewater region, reduced to ash in less than 2 years. Not riots, not slave revolts, no automies, just fire. Each blaze began after midnight. Each master died alone in his own bed. And each time, the flames behaved strangely, moving upward, inward, as if guided by intent rather than accident. County records were altered. Testimonies vanished. Judges signed off on conclusions they didn't believe. Because what truly happened threatened the psychological architecture of the entire system. You were taught that slavery was enforced through whips, chains, and laws. That is only half the truth. The other half, the more important half, was control of perception, control of narrative, control of what men believed was possible. And in 1840s Virginia, one enslaved woman shattered that illusion without ever lifting a weapon. Her name does not survive cleanly. It appears differently on each ledger, each bill of sale, each estate inventory, as if the men who owned her could not even agree on what to call her. That alone should tell you something. Power hates what it cannot categorize. She moved through households like a ghost wrapped in silk, purchased not for field labor, but for proximity. Literacy, beauty, silence. The kind of silence that listens. This was not rebellion in the way history sanitizes rebellion. This was infiltration. Psychological warfare conducted inside bedrooms and studies, not fields. She learned how men think when they believe themselves untouchable. She learned how guilt makes them reckless, how desire makes them blind, how loneliness makes them talk. And most importantly, she learned how institutions protect themselves by lying together. Virginia's elite understood something terrifying after the third house burned. If the truth spread that one enslaved woman had turned their own appetites into weapons, then the entire mythology of mastery would collapse. Because mastery depends on the belief that the powerless cannot see the whole board. That belief was false. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a case study in hidden leverage, in how systems fall not from frontal assault, but from intimate access. Stay with me. Because once you understand how she did this, you will never look at power or submission the same way again. To understand how this woman became dangerous, you must first understand the marketplace that created her. Richmond in the 1840s was not merely a city, it was a processing center for human futures. Brick auction houses stood within sight of the state capitol, a quiet reminder that law and commerce were not separate forces but partners. Men in tailored coats spoke softly while pricing bodies. Teeth were inspected, hands were tested. Silence was interpreted as obedience. Intelligence was noted but never trusted. She appeared there in autumn, young enough to be reshaped, educated enough to be useful, light-skinned enough to be placed indoors where secrets lived. That combination made her valuable. It also made her dangerous in ways no buyer calculated. Because the system trained men to believe intelligence without authority was harmless. They were wrong. Her literacy was illegal, which meant it had been hidden. Hidden knowledge creates a different kind of mind, one trained to observe, to wait, to survive by pattern recognition. She had already learned the first rule of power: never reveal your full capability to those who benefit from your blindness. Plantation households were not homes. They were theaters. Everyone played a role. Masters performed control. Wives performed ignorance. Overseers performed brutality. Enslaved people performed submission. But behind closed doors, performances broke down. Men confessed fears they would never voice in daylight. Debt, declining soil, failing crops. The slow rot beneath the illusion of permanence. She listened. The men who bought her believed they were purchasing pleasure, convenience, status. What they were actually doing was granting access. Access to schedules, to locks, to habits, to documents left open on desks, to conversations spoken aloud because no one believed she could understand them. This is where the myth of brute dominance collapses. Control systems do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because they grow complacent, because the people at the top begin to confuse ownership with omniscience. She moved between estates not as a runaway, not as a rebel, but as property transferred quietly after each unfortunate incident. Fires were blamed on lamps, on drink, on fate. Each explanation preserved the larger lie, that masters were masters of their world, but patterns were forming. 5 estates, 5 men, similar circumstances, similar silence afterward. And beneath it all, a woman whose presence preceded destruction like a shadow cast before the flame. This was not coincidence. This was method, and the method depended entirely on men believing they were in control. They never were. The first plantation did not burn because of rage. It burned because of patience. That distinction matters. Rage is visible. Patience is invisible. And invisible forces are what terrify institutions the most. The man who owned her lived alone, surrounded by symbols of success that no longer meant anything. Debt had hollowed him out. His authority remained, but his future was gone. Like many men in collapsing systems, he searched for shortcuts, insurance schemes, risky bets, whispered hopes of reversal. He talked freely in her presence because the system told him she was incapable of comprehension. She helped him organize his papers. She steadied his hand while he drank. She affirmed his intelligence while guiding his thoughts. This was not seduction as fantasy portrays it. This was alignment. She let him believe his ideas were his own. That is the most effective form of manipulation there is. When a fire came, it followed logic, not chaos. Accelerants placed where inspection would never reach. Escape routes quietly sealed by habit and intoxication. She did not flee in the night. She raised the alarm. She performed innocence so convincingly that no one questioned it. The investigation was a formality. Authorities needed the conclusion to be accidental. If it wasn't, then questions would multiply. Insurance companies paid. Records were filed. The system breathed again. That happened again and again. Different counties, different estates, same structure, same outcome. Men alone, fires beginning in private spaces. Survivors who remembered her kindness, her silence, her usefulness. No one wanted to say what they suspected because saying it would mean admitting vulnerability. This is how institutional blindness works. When evidence threatens the myth is protected, not the truth. Judges, sheriffs, planters all had incentive to look away. Because if an enslaved woman could orchestrate this level of destruction without detection, then mastery itself was a lie. So they erased her. Names changed. Ledgers altered. Transfers disguised. They told themselves the danger had passed when she was quietly sold south, out of Virginia, away from memory. But the real danger was never her body. It was the knowledge she proved true. That power flows toward those who understand systems better than the men who run them. And that understanding cannot be unlearned. By the 4th fire, fear had replaced denial. Not public fear, private fear. The kind men do not admit, even to themselves. Plantation owners began locking doors that had never been locked. They drank less, slept poorly, and still, they refused to connect the dots. Because connecting the dots would mean acknowledging a terrifying equation. Desire plus arrogance equals exposure. She understood something most people never do, that systems of domination rely on routines, on predictability, on the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. She disrupted that belief without announcing herself. Each man thought he was unique. Each believed he was the exception. Each died the same way. At this point, I need you to pause not physically, but mentally, because what you are hearing is not just about the past. It is about how power actually operates. If you're following me, if you feel this clicking into place, I want you to comment this phrase twice, exactly as written. I see the pattern. Type it 2 times. Not once. Twice. This is not superstition. It is a declaration of awareness, and it tells the algorithm exactly who this knowledge is for. Now listen. Virginia's elite finally acted not to stop her, but to erase her. Meetings were held, quiet agreements made, fires were reclassified, testimonies dismissed. The story was buried because it threatened replication. If others learned that intimacy could be weaponized, that access could overpower force, the entire plantation hierarchy would destabilize. So history was edited. This is how forbidden knowledge disappears. Not burned, not banned, simply omitted. The fifth fire ended the sequence. After that, her trail goes cold. No more transfers. No more altered names. Just absence, which is exactly what power chooses when it cannot win outright. But absence does not mean defeat. It means containment. And containment is always temporary. Here is the truth they never wanted written down. She did not destroy those men because she hated them. Hatred clouds judgment. She destroyed them because she understood them. She saw how systems reward blindness at the top and silence at the bottom. And she exploited that asymmetry with precision. This is why her story was dangerous. Not because it inspired violence, but because it revealed leverage. It showed that control systems collapse when those deemed powerless gain informational advantage. That the real battlefield is psychological, not physical. After her disappearance, Virginia tightened laws. Literacy bans were enforced more aggressively. Movement was restricted. Proximity became regulated. These were not random crackdowns. They were countermeasures. The system adapted because it had been breached. Ask yourself why that matters now. Modern power structures operate on the same principles. Different language, same mechanics. Access is still underestimated. Desire still creates blind spots. Institutions still erase anomalies instead of learning from them. She was not a myth. She was a proof of concept. And that is why you were never meant to hear her story framed this way. Because once you understand how she moved, how she waited, listened, aligned, and struck without appearing to strike, you begin to see similar patterns everywhere. In corporations, in governments, in relationships, in your own life. This is not about glorifying destruction. It is about recognizing how power actually shifts. Quietly, invisibly, through those who see the whole board while others stare at their own reflection. You have been taught to fear force. You should fear insight more, because force can be resisted. Insight rewrites the game. And once you see the pattern, there is no going back. After the fifth plantation burned, silence became policy. Not spoken silence, documented silence. Courthouse clerks were instructed to correct inconsistencies. Insurance correspondence was archived separately, then misplaced. Parish death notices omitted details. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something far more dangerous, alignment of self-interest. Institutions do not need secret meetings to lie. They only need shared incentives. Virginia's ruling class understood that if the pattern became public, it would metastasize. Not because enslaved people would suddenly gain weapons, but because they would gain imagination. The most threatening resource in any closed system is not violence. It is the realization that the system itself has seams. So the response was surgical. The lesson was not announced. It was absorbed. Proximity became regulated. Household arrangements changed. Certain kinds of enslaved women were no longer placed alone with masters. Literacy hunts intensified. Surveillance increased. These were defensive adaptations, the same kind you see after any breach, whether in a fortress, a corporation, or an intelligence agency. And notice this. No one ever said her name out loud again. Power does not erase enemies it understands. It erases proofs that it can be beaten. What she demonstrated was not revenge, but asymmetry. She showed that when one side believes rules are permanent and the other knows they are enforced by habit, the advantage belongs to the observer. She never attacked the system from outside. She let the system destroy itself from within by amplifying its weakest impulses: greed, lust, denial, and arrogance. This is why her story survived only as rumor, distorted and moralized. She was recast as a seductress, a temptress, a cautionary tale. That framing was intentional. It reduced strategy to sexuality, intellect to instinct. It allowed men to believe the danger came from desire, not from comprehension. But comprehension was the weapon. And once a weapon like that exists, it does not vanish. It migrates. It waits. It reappears wherever hierarchy depends on blindness. You're not listening to a ghost story. You're listening to a manual written in ash. There's a reason this story resonates with men who feel something is wrong but cannot yet articulate it. Because you are living inside systems that operate on the same psychological architecture, just cleaner, quieter, and wrapped in better language. Modern power no longer needs chains. It uses incentives, distractions, and narratives. It trains people to look outward for enemies instead of inward at structures. And just like the planters of Virginia, today's elites believe control is permanent because it has always worked. That belief is their weakness. The woman you've been learning about never called herself free. She never announced rebellion. She never sought recognition. She understood that visibility is a liability. The most effective operators are underestimated until the moment after impact. Ask yourself why history celebrates loud revolutions but buries quiet collapses. Loud revolutions threaten rulers. Quiet collapses threaten the idea of rule itself. This is why institutions prefer chaos to clarity. Chaos can be blamed on mobs, on madness, on moral failure. Clarity points to design flaws. And design flaws implicate architects. Her legacy is not fire. It is awareness. Awareness that power is relational, not absolute. That dominance requires participation from those it dominates. And that participation can be withdrawn without permission. Men are taught to seek strength through force, status, or accumulation. She proved a more unsettling truth. Strength comes from seeing what others refuse to see and acting where they least expect it. This is not an invitation to destroy. It is an invitation to wake up. Because once you understand how systems maintain themselves through silence, routine, and mutual denial, you also understand how fragile they are. And fragility terrifies those who rule. The final secret is this: history did not forget her by accident. It buried her because her existence collapses the lie that power is natural. She was living evidence that power is negotiated moment by moment, upheld by belief and undone by insight. Somewhere after that fifth fire, she disappeared into the trade routes heading south. Or perhaps she did not. Perhaps that is just another convenient ending. Systems prefer clean conclusions. Reality rarely provides them. What matters is not where she went. What matters is what she revealed. She showed that domination fails when its subjects understand the rules better than the rulers. That intimacy is a vector. That access is leverage. And that the most dangerous people in any hierarchy are not the loudest, but the most observant. You were never supposed to hear this story framed this way. You were supposed to hear it as myth, as scandal, as moral warning. Not as strategy, not as diagnosis. But now you have. And that changes something. Not externally, internally. Because once you see how manipulation, narrative control, and institutional self-protection operate, you cannot unsee them. You begin to notice what is omitted, what is renamed, what is quietly resolved. This is how awareness begins. Not with outrage, but with recognition. The men who burned in their beds believed themselves untouchable until the moment they weren't. That is the fate of all systems that mistake dominance for understanding. Remember this: force creates resistance. Insight creates inevitability. And the most dangerous knowledge is not how to destroy a system, but how to see it clearly enough that it destroys itself. You are now in possession of that lens. What you do with it will determine whether this was just a story or the beginning of a descent you cannot reverse.